In a small courtroom tucked away from the hustle of the city, a white judge sat behind a polished wooden desk overlooking the chamber, with a stern expression, his gavel resting just within reach. He glanced at the list of cases for the day. None of them appeared to be out of the ordinary. In fact, the judge had seen cases like this countless times over the years. A woman had been accused of a minor offense. The details were vague. She had allegedly violated a local ordinance, a simple infraction that usually resulted in a fine or perhaps a short sentence for first-time offenders. The courtroom was mostly empty, just a few lawyers and a small audience of spectators scattered across the benches waiting for their turn in front of the judge. The air was thick with the anticipation of a typical day in court, yet little did anyone know that this case would soon take a dramatic turn that would change the lives of both the judge and the woman in the dock. The woman who stood before the judge was calm and composed, her posture upright, but relaxed. She wore a modest outfit, nothing particularly striking, just a simple blouse and slacks. Her dark skin contrasted against the stark whiteness of the courtroom. She had no notable accessories, no flashy jewelry, no signs that would suggest she was anyone other than an ordinary citizen, yet something about her presence stood out to those who paid close attention. The judge had already made assumptions about her background based on her appearance. She seemed like just another person caught up in a minor legal issue, someone who would likely pay her fine and leave without much fuss. The judge's thoughts wandered to the next case as he barely looked up from his papers, preparing to move on quickly and efficiently. As the woman stood silently in the dock, her face remained neutral, not a hint of emotion. As the judge read aloud the charges she faced, the offense was trivial in the grand scheme of things, yet the fine that was about to be imposed would still be a heavy burden for some. The woman didn't flinch. She simply listened without interruption to the judge's words. Her eyes remained fixed on him as he spoke, but there was no sign of fear or worry in her demeanor, only an unwavering calmness that seemed almost out of place in a situation where most would have shown at least a trace of frustration or anxiety. As the judge finished his statement, he looked up at her expectantly, waiting for a response, but the woman simply nodded and offered a brief "Yes, Your Honor," as though she had already accepted the outcome of the case. The judge considered her response with a slight furrow of his brow. Perhaps there was something more to this woman than he had initially thought, but he quickly dismissed the thought. After all, it was just a simple case, and he had seen hundreds like it over the years. Nothing extraordinary about it, certainly nothing worth further investigation. He raised his gavel and slammed it down with authority. The fine was set, the case was closed. He moved on to the next item on the docket, and the woman quietly made her way out of the courtroom without another word. But as the door closed behind her, something happened that neither the judge nor the rest of the courtroom was prepared for. Word spread quickly outside of the court that the woman was no ordinary defendant. In fact, she was far from it. Her name was whispered by a few in the courtroom, and soon the rumors began to swirl. She wasn't just a person dealing with a minor offense. She was a highly respected human rights lawyer, known for her tireless work defending marginalized communities, speaking out against injustice, and fighting for the voiceless on a global scale. The judge would soon learn that the woman before him was not someone who could be easily dismissed as just another statistic in a crowded docket. The whispers grew louder as the truth about the woman began to spread across the courtroom. People exchanged surprised glances, some in disbelief, while others who had known her name felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The same woman who had stood so quietly in front of the judge moments ago was no stranger to the world of law or justice. She had fought battles in far more challenging arenas. Her reputation had spread far beyond the city limits, and yet in this courtroom today, she had been reduced to just another defendant accused of a minor offense, with no one knowing who she truly was. It was a stark contrast to the reality of her life, one where her every move was watched and scrutinized by those who followed her work. The judge had no idea that his decision to impose a fine on this woman would come to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. The revelation of her identity hit the courtroom like a tidal wave. The murmurs became more pronounced as people started to recognize her face and connect it to her famous name. She had worked on some of the most high-profile human rights cases over the years, and her name had become synonymous with advocacy for the oppressed and downtrodden. The more the crowd learned, the more the judge's initial confidence began to slip away. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image he had of this woman with the reality of who she truly was. How could he have made such a careless decision? Had he been too quick to judge her based solely on her appearance? The weight of his error began to sink in as he realized that he had imposed a fine on someone who had dedicated her life to ensuring that others received justice. The judge tried to refocus his attention on the proceedings, but his mind kept returning to the woman in question. How could he have missed the signs, the subtle confidence in her stance, the calm way in which she had responded to the charges? It was almost as though she had been prepared for this moment, as if she had faced much more formidable challenges than a simple court case. Her composure had been so strikingly different from the usual defendants who came through his courtroom, and yet he had not thought twice about it, dismissing her as just another person who had found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Outside the courtroom, the news continued to spread. The woman's identity was no longer a secret, and the media soon caught wind of the story. They rushed to interview anyone who might have known her or witnessed the scene in the courtroom. Her colleagues in the human rights field began to speak out, expressing shock at the way she had been treated. They condemned the judge's decision, pointing out that her legal expertise and advocacy for justice should have made her a person of respect, not someone subjected to an unjust fine. The story quickly gained traction, and before long the judge's actions were being scrutinized by those who had followed the woman's career with admiration and reverence. The judge found himself unable to escape the growing pressure. The public eye was now fixed firmly on him. As he began to realize the full scope of his mistake, he could no longer ignore the gravity of his decision, nor could he avoid the questions that would inevitably come his way. As the day wore on, he found himself wondering how he could have been so oblivious, how he could have failed to recognize the woman before him for what she truly represented: her years of service to human rights, her commitment to those who had been forgotten by society. And yet in that one moment he had reduced her to a mere defendant standing in front of him, as though she were just another person to be fined without consideration for who she was or what she had accomplished. The guilt began to eat away at him as the weight of his actions settled in. He had made a judgment without understanding the full context, and now he was left to grapple with the consequences of his own ignorance. As the day went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been deeply wrong with the way he had treated this woman, someone who deserved respect and recognition, not punishment and disdain. The judge sat in his office later that day, staring out of the window, his mind still racing over the events that had unfolded earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he turned over the papers on his desk, but his focus kept drifting back to the image of the woman standing before him. Her calm demeanor, her composed presence, her quiet strength, all of it had been a stark contrast to the usual defendants he dealt with, yet he had dismissed it without a second thought, as if it meant nothing. He had never questioned his assumptions about her, and now he was grappling with the realization that his assumptions had been entirely wrong. He had failed to recognize her not just as a defendant, but as someone whose life's work had been dedicated to the cause of justice. The weight of his decision hung heavy on him, and he knew that the truth of what had just happened was beginning to spread beyond the courtroom. The public had already learned about the woman's identity and her work as a human rights lawyer, and now there was an undeniable shift in the way people viewed him and his actions. He could already sense the judgment from his peers and colleagues, who were now looking at him with new eyes. He had been careless and thoughtless in his judgment of the woman, and the consequences of that mistake were becoming painfully clear. As the news spread about the judge's fine and the woman's true identity, the courtroom began to buzz with conversation and speculation. People who had once been silent now had something to say. Those who had witnessed the scene in the courtroom began to reflect on their own reactions to the woman they had seen. How many of them had missed the signs? How many of them had assumed she was just another person caught up in a trivial case without realizing who she truly was? How many had failed to see her as more than just the color of her skin or the clothes she wore? The realization that they too had made assumptions about her began to weigh on them, and the more they thought about it, the more uncomfortable it became for everyone involved. The judge's colleagues in the legal community began to reach out to him, offering their opinions on what had happened. Some were critical, others more understanding. But the judge knew that the damage had been done. He had made a decision based on bias and prejudice, and now he had to reckon with the consequences of that decision. The woman he had found was not just any ordinary person. She was someone whose actions had made a profound impact on the world, and yet he had treated her like any other defendant who had walked into his courtroom without even taking the time to understand who she was or what she represented. As the day wore on, the judge found himself reflecting on the broader implications of his actions. He had not only wronged the woman, but he had also perpetuated the same systems of inequality and injustice that she had spent her life fighting against. He had contributed to the very problem that she was working to dismantle, and now he was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of his own complicity in that system. He had to ask himself how many others had been subjected to similar treatment, how many others had been judged based on superficial factors, how many had been denied justice because of assumptions and biases like the ones he had made. The judge began to feel a sense of urgency. He needed to correct his mistake, but he knew that it wouldn't be as simple as apologizing or offering a public statement. He had to confront the deeper issues within himself and within the system he was a part of, and that process would take time and introspection. It would require him to challenge his own beliefs and biases and to re-examine the way he interacted with those who came before him in his courtroom. But for now, all he could do was reflect on the gravity of his mistake and wonder how he could begin to make things right. The next morning, the judge arrived at court early, his mind still preoccupied with the events from the day before. His steps felt heavier than usual as he walked through the hallways of the courthouse. The familiar hum of the busy building felt distant to him today. Everything seemed out of sync. The usual flow of cases, the voices of lawyers arguing, the shuffle of papers, it all seemed to fade into the background as his mind replayed the scene in the courtroom. The woman, the realization that he had misjudged her. He knew he couldn't undo what had been done, but he couldn't just move on. As if nothing had happened, he had to do something about it. But he didn't know where to start or how to fix the damage he had caused. As he sat at his desk preparing for the day's proceedings, his mind wandered back to the moment when he had first imposed the fine. He had been so quick to deliver the judgment, without thinking, without considering the woman's background or her significance in the broader context of the law. He had been too focused on the technicalities of the case, the minor violation, the supposed offense, without recognizing the person standing in front of him. He had been blinded by his own assumptions, and now the weight of his actions seemed unbearable. He wondered if anyone else in the courtroom had noticed the same things he had missed. Had they too been so quick to judge her based on her appearance? Had they too been blinded by prejudice? Or was it just him? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was complicit in a larger problem that had been festering for years, a problem that went beyond just this case, a problem that existed within the very fabric of the legal system. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the fine he had imposed on the woman was just one small example of a much larger issue, one that needed to be addressed, not just by him, but by everyone who worked within the system. The judge decided he needed to learn more about the woman he had found to understand her work and the impact she had made over the years. He reached out to colleagues who had worked with her or who had witnessed her in action. They spoke of her tireless dedication to human rights, her passion for justice, and the countless lives she had touched through her legal work. He learned of the cases she had taken on, the communities she had defended, the laws she had fought to change, and the injustices she had fought to expose. It became clear to him that the woman was not just a lawyer, she was a force for change, a champion of the oppressed and the marginalized, and yet he had treated her as if she were just another defendant in a routine case. The more he learned about her, the more ashamed he felt at his own actions. How could he have been so blind? How could he have missed the significance of the woman standing before him? It was as if he had failed to see the depth of her character, the weight of her experience, the strength of her convictions. Instead, he had focused solely on the surface-level details of the case, the minor offense, the fine he had imposed, without understanding who she was or what she represented. He realized that he had to make it right. He couldn't undo the fine, but he could at least acknowledge his mistake and offer a public apology to her to show that he recognized the gravity of his error and the harm it had caused. He knew that this wouldn't erase the damage that had been done, but it was a step in the right direction. The judge composed himself and prepared to take action. He couldn't afford to stay silent anymore. He couldn't afford to pretend that everything was okay, when he knew that he had failed to uphold the values of justice and fairness he had sworn to protect. With a sense of resolve, he decided to speak to the woman directly. He needed to look her in the eye and offer her an apology. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. The judge didn't know how she would respond, but he knew that he had to do it for his own conscience and for the integrity of the legal system he served. The judge spent the rest of the day reflecting on how to approach the woman and what to say to her. The thought of confronting her made him uneasy, but he knew it was necessary. He couldn't let the day pass without making amends. He had come to understand the weight of his mistake, but he wasn't sure if his apology would be enough to make up for the harm he had caused. As he prepared for the end of the day, he hoped that she would be receptive to his words, but he was also painfully aware that an apology might not be enough to repair the damage to his reputation or to his standing in the community. He finally decided to reach out through her colleagues, hoping that they might help facilitate the conversation. He wasn't sure how to approach someone as accomplished as she was, especially given that he had imposed a fine on her without the slightest understanding of her role in the world of human rights. He was also unsure of her feelings toward him. Would she even want to speak with him after what had happened? Would she see his apology as genuine or as just another attempt to cover up his error? He understood that his actions had placed her in an uncomfortable position, and that any words he offered might not change the impact of that moment in court. His colleagues were surprised when he contacted them. They knew the judge to be a man of integrity and experience, but they also understood that what had transpired in the courtroom had shaken him deeply. The news about the woman had spread quickly, and while many were sympathetic to her situation, there was an undercurrent of judgment toward the judge from some quarters. They knew that the public opinion would not be kind, and that the pressure would continue to mount until the judge took responsibility for his mistake. The judge knew that he had to confront this, not just for the sake of his career, but to regain his own sense of moral clarity. When the call was made to the woman's office, the response was calm yet firm. She was willing to meet with him, but only under certain conditions. He wanted to ensure that their meeting would be centered on a genuine discussion of his actions and the broader implications of his behavior. She wasn't interested in a superficial apology or a quick fix to his reputation. She needed to know that the judge understood the depths of his mistake and the effect it had on those who had been marginalized by the very system he was supposed to uphold. The judge agreed to the terms, and arrangements were made for the following day. The meeting would take place in a neutral setting, a small coffee shop away from the courthouse. The judge felt a knot form in his stomach as the time approached. He had no idea how the conversation would unfold, but he knew he had to be prepared for anything. He couldn't control her response, but he could control the sincerity of his words. He hoped she would hear him out and understand that he was truly remorseful for his actions. The morning of the meeting arrived, and the judge found himself pacing nervously in his office. He had rehearsed his apology countless times, but none of the words seemed to feel right. He wasn't sure if words alone could convey the depth of his regret, and he wasn't sure how she would receive them, but he had come to terms with the fact that there were no guarantees. The only thing he could do was speak from the heart. As he walked into the coffee shop, he saw her sitting at a corner table. Her calm demeanor was the same as it had been in the courtroom, but now there was a sharpness in her gaze that he hadn't noticed before. The weight of the past few days hung heavy in the air between them. As the judge approached, she stood and extended her hand. The moment was brief but powerful, and as they sat down across from one another, he felt a mixture of fear and hope. The judge knew that this conversation would be pivotal for both of them, but he also knew that whatever happened, he could no longer remain silent. He had to face the consequences of his actions. The judge took a deep breath as he sat down across from her. The silence between them felt thick and charged, but he knew that it was his responsibility to break it. He looked at her, eyes steady and unflinching in front of him. He had prepared for this moment, But now that it was here, words seemed to escape him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and his thoughts raced as he tried to gather his thoughts. He had never been in a situation quite like this before, where his actions had so directly impacted another person's life in such a profound way. And now he had to face the woman whose life's work he had inadvertently undermined, all because of his own ignorance and bias. She sat there composed, but there was something in her posture that hinted at the intensity of her emotions. She was a person who had been in many high-pressure situations, yet the way she looked at him now made it clear that this conversation was different. It wasn't about a case or a legal argument. It was about something much deeper, something that had to do with fairness, dignity, and respect. And the judge knew that she wasn't going to make this easy for him. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding and accountability. He started slowly, unsure of where to begin, but the words came out anyway. "I want to start by saying that I made a terrible mistake." He paused, looking down at his hands before meeting her gaze again. "And I recognize that my actions in that courtroom were wrong in so many ways. I judged you based on assumptions, and I did not take the time to understand who you are or what you stand for. And for that I am deeply sorry. I understand now that I didn't just impose a fine. I denied you the respect and acknowledgement you deserve." Her eyes never wavered as she listened, but there was no immediate response from her face. It was hard for the judge to tell if she was processing his words or if she was waiting for him to say more. Either way, he knew that this apology wasn't the end of the conversation. It was only the beginning, and that it had to go much deeper if it was to be meaningful. "I can't undo the harm I've caused," he continued, "but I need you to understand that I am taking full responsibility for what happened. I am committed to changing the way I approach my cases and the way I see the people who stand before me. I can't change the past, but I will do everything in my power to make sure that this doesn't happen again." The woman sat in silence for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and the judge wondered if his words had even reached her, or if they had fallen flat against the weight of everything that had happened. But then finally she spoke, her voice steady, but tinged with something deeper. "There's a lot that needs to be done," she said quietly, "but I don't think your apology is enough for me or for anyone else who has been treated this way. I've seen the way people like you judge people like me based on the color of our skin and the assumptions you make about our lives without ever bothering to look beneath the surface to see who we really are." Her words stung, but the judge knew she was right. He had been so quick to assume that she was just another defendant caught up in a minor offense, when in reality she had been a warrior for justice. He had failed to see her not just as a person, but as someone whose life's work had been dedicated to defending the rights of the oppressed and marginalized, and in doing so he had contributed to the very systems of inequality she had been fighting against. "I know that," she continued, "this goes beyond just you and me. This is a systemic issue. It's not just about one judge or one case. It's about how people like you in positions of power make decisions about people like me based on nothing but stereotypes and biases. You've got to understand that this kind of thing doesn't just affect me, it affects countless others who never get the chance to stand up for themselves. And I need to know that you're committed to changing that, not just for me, but for everyone who has been hurt by the very systems you help to uphold." The judge sat there in silence, absorbing her words. They were hard to hear, but necessary, and he knew that she was right. The work ahead wasn't just about apologizing. It was about true change, real change that would require him to look inward and examine his own role in the perpetuation of injustice. He realized that her words weren't just a challenge to him, they were a call to action, and he wasn't sure where that path would lead, but he knew that he had to follow it. The judge felt a weight settle in his chest as the woman's words echoed in his mind. They had hit him harder than he had expected, and for the first time in his career, he felt the enormity of the system. He had been a part of the way it had shaped him, the way it had allowed him to make decisions that affected the lives of others, without ever truly understanding their struggles. He thought about her words, the ones about stereotypes and biases, and he realized how often he had relied on his own perceptions to make judgments without recognizing how much he had been influenced by the world around him, the assumptions that had been ingrained in him since childhood, the way he had been taught to view the world through a particular lens without ever questioning it. "I can't change the past," he thought, "but I can start to change the future." He looked up at her, and saw the sincerity in her eyes, the quiet strength that had made her a formidable force in the world of human rights. She was right, this wasn't just about him, it was about the entire system, the larger structures of power and inequality that allowed people like him to hold positions of authority without fully understanding the consequences of their actions. He had spent his career making decisions based on law and precedent, but now he saw how little he had actually considered the human lives behind the cases he presided over. "I don't have all the answers," he said quietly, "but I want to change, I want to learn. And I want to be a part of creating a system that truly serves justice, not just in theory, but in practice." He paused, unsure if his words would resonate with her, but knowing that he had to be honest. "The work you've done, it's important," he continued, "it matters, and I see that now. I see how much more there is to the work of justice than what I've been taught." She nodded slowly, and for a moment the silence between them was filled with understanding. She knew that this wasn't going to be an easy journey for him or for anyone, but she could sense the sincerity in his voice, and that made her feel a glimmer of hope. She had seen so many people in positions of power refuse to change even when confronted with their own shortcomings, and it was rare that anyone in a position like his took responsibility for their actions, much less sought to change the way they thought about the world around them. The journey ahead wasn't going to be simple or without challenges, but she had to admit that something in the judge had shifted. She could see that he was genuinely grappling with the consequences of his mistake, and that was a rare sight in a world where people often double down on their mistakes rather than confront them head-on. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, her voice steady, but carrying a weight of its own. "But you have to understand, this change can't be just words. It has to be reflected in your actions. It has to show up in the way you make decisions in the courtroom, and in the way you look at the people who stand before you. You have to be willing to confront your own biases, even when they're uncomfortable, and that's not easy." "I know," he said, "I know, and I'm ready to do the work. I don't expect anyone to trust me right away, but I'm committed to learning and to holding myself accountable for the impact my actions have on others." The conversation stretched on as they talked about the challenges ahead, the changes that needed to be made not just in his own life, but in the larger structures of the legal system. They spoke about bias training reforms that needed to be implemented and the importance of creating spaces for marginalized voices to be heard. But through it all there was a sense of understanding between them, a sense that even though their paths had crossed under difficult circumstances, there was a possibility for growth, a chance for the judge to learn and evolve in ways he had never anticipated when he first took the bench. By the end of the meeting, the judge felt a sense of clarity that he hadn't had before. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with hard lessons, but for the first time in his career, he felt ready to take on that challenge, to face the discomfort of his own growth, and to use his position to make the system better, even if it was just one case at a time. As he stood to leave the coffee shop, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not because the work was done, but because for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. As the judge walked out of the coffee shop, he felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. He had taken the first step, but he knew that it was only the beginning. There was still so much work ahead of him, so much to unlearn, so much to change. He couldn't ignore the weight of the conversation he had just had, or the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. It wasn't just about his own transformation, it was about the transformation of the system he had spent his life working within. And he knew that he had to continue pushing himself to do better, to challenge the way things had always been done, and to hold himself accountable at every turn. In the days that followed, the judge started to make changes in small but meaningful ways. He enrolled in a program focused on bias training and began to attend discussions about race and justice. He reached out to colleagues who had a deeper understanding of these issues and sought their guidance. He listened more intently to the people who came before him in court and began to recognize the ways in which his own biases had shaped his decisions. He wasn't perfect, and there were moments when the old patterns tried to creep back in, but he caught himself and made an effort to correct it. Meanwhile, the woman he had wronged continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that her encounter with the judge had opened a door to something bigger, and while she didn't expect instant change, she felt encouraged by the fact that he had taken the first step in acknowledging his mistake. She saw the potential for real transformation not just within him, but within the entire system of justice. She continued to fight for the rights of the oppressed and marginalized, knowing that the battle was far from over, but also knowing that change was possible even in places where it had seemed impossible. One day as the judge walked into the courtroom, he noticed something that made him stop for a moment. He saw the woman in the back of the room sitting quietly with her colleagues. She wasn't there for a case or for any legal proceedings, but just as an observer, and for the first time since their meeting, the judge felt a sense of pride within himself. He had worked hard over the past few weeks to change his mindset, to challenge his assumptions, and to ensure that he no longer judged people based on the color of their skin or their socioeconomic background. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but seeing her there reminded him that change was not just possible, it was happening. He walked toward her table after the session ended, and she stood to greet him this time. There was no tension in the air, no discomfort, just mutual respect. He felt a quiet sense of gratitude toward her for the way she had opened his eyes, and for the way she had challenged him to be better. He knew that he could never fully repay her for the lesson she had taught him, but he hoped that through his actions he could prove to her that her faith in him hadn't been misplaced. "I've been making an effort to listen and learn," he said as he stood before her. "I've been trying to be more mindful of how I make decisions and the impact those decisions have on the people who come before me." He paused and looked into her eyes. "I still have a lot of work to do, but I want you to know that I'm committed to this journey." She nodded in acknowledgement, and there was a slight smile on her lips, not one of celebration but of understanding. She had seen the changes in him, and she knew that his words were not empty, they were backed by action, and that was all she needed to see. She wasn't looking for grand gestures or public displays of regret. She just needed to know that he was sincere and that he was willing to make real change. "I believe you," she said quietly, "and that's all any of us can ask for." She paused, then added, "Keep doing the work, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop listening, because the moment you stop listening is the moment the system wins." The judge felt a deep sense of responsibility settle in his chest. As he left the courtroom that day, he knew that his journey wasn't over, and that the work of dismantling prejudice and bias was ongoing, but he also knew that the path he was on was the right one, and that for the first time in a long time, he was standing on the side of justice, not just as a judge, but as a person who had finally begun to understand the full weight of what it meant to serve that justice. He had taken the first step, and as he continued down the road ahead, he knew that every decision he made from here on out would be a reflection of the lessons he had learned and the responsibility he now carried with him.